I'm Norma Honaker, and I'll be your speaker for today. And my topic, as you can see here, is Warrior Women, Women's Autobiography in the 18th Century Nation at War. But you should also notice that there is a definite difference in the type of photos that are present on that title page. Instead, what I've presented here are photos from my past. In particular, my military service. While I do teach now here at ETSU in literature and language and women's studies, I spent more than a dozen years on active duty as a field grade Army officer in the Nuclear, Biological, and Chemical Warfare Services. Has a lot to do with English, right? But what it does have to do with certainly is women's issues. And I'd like to talk to you about the significance of national image and gender, as well as women's work, because we all know that women and gender do not so easily meet. That's for today. But I also want to remind you that on the 13th at 5 p.m. in the East Tennessee room will be the Notable Women Award of ETSU, and that again next month we have another lecture in the Women on Wednesdays selection. What it was like in 1994 when I went on active duty as a lieutenant. It was a very interesting time in the U.S. Political history in particular. Congress in October of 1994 opened up a number of jobs to women. Now, this happened in response to the overwhelming number of women who were serving in the Gulf War and serving with distinction, as well as what the volunteer army or standing armies changing composition needed to adjust to. Specifically, more working class and Southern women were going into the military than at any other time. In fact, the women make up 15% of the armed forces at any given time. And certainly could probably, in certain units, be even greater. I commanded a company of 210 in the Republic of Korea, and 65% of my soldiers were female. Isn't that odd? It was just an odd year and an odd recruitment. So certainly that led to some interesting situations. Specifically, I would have tank commanders say to me, well, you know you're only supposed to send men to me. And I would say, you have one choice. Well, actually two. I can send women to you and you can accommodate them in your porta potty allotment, in their housing, and maintaining security so they aren't raped. Or you can have no one. Those are the two choices. And that was very much reality, but it was an unspoken reality. In fact, the job that I went to in December of 1994 was a premier position that had just opened to women. I was going to be the first platoon leader, and that's me. Those are my guys. Those are our vehicles. It was fun. I had 32 men, and I was the only woman. And I was so overwhelmingly proud. It was an 18 Airborne Corps unit, so it was quick deploying. We had very active training schedules. As you can see there, we're in the desert. It was fun. It was great for my career. And then about 18 months into that job, I began to reflect on gender more specifically. I found a memorandum signed by a Lieutenant Chin. And when I looked closer, the name was that of a woman. So I asked the non-commissioned officer who'd been there for, 5 years, decades, something like that. I'm like, was there another woman here before me? And lo and behold, there had been. She had served there because there were no men available for that job. And the commanders had justified it that if they had gone to war, that the Army would miraculously find a man to go into that job to be deployed. Now the chances of that happening, I see a little doubt. Yes, it's possible it wouldn't have happened. But well into the global war on terrorism in our own decade, we have seen repeatedly the forced questioning of where women are on the battlefield. The whole scope and nature of war had changed. Here you can see I was on missions in the desert. I was in an armored unit with a huge machine gun on it, right? We were loading, that's me with the hair, right? The rest of the people don't have hair, that's how you know they're men. We were loading vehicles onto C-5 Galaxy aircraft. And the only picture I have that really is distinctly feminine would be my skirt, right? And I hope that you can tell just if I'm looking here, that's my female mechanic. Can you tell that it's a woman? No. You look kind of the same when you're in this gear, don't you? And clothing is definitely part of the process of gendering that goes on in the military. In fact, many people have remarked on the way that I dress now as a gendered performance, that of masculine. I say, no, not really. This is what I wore in the Army. It's what I'm comfortable in after most of my life, right? So let's think about clothing, and let's think about where women are in the battlefield. Women are legend in battle. Who hasn't heard of Joan of Arc? She motivated men. She was part of maintaining an ongoing civil war, as opposed to all the politics going around her. Their morale went up when she would show up there in battle. The governments involved were so frightened of her that they chose to not exchange her once she was captured for the money that she would have brought. Instead, they tried her as a heretic. And what was the charge that she was guilty of? Not leading men in battle, not killing men in battle. Her charge was having worn men's clothing. That is what she was convicted of. It is why she was burned at the stake. Now, her burning at the stake was irrational. It was a move to get rid of someone who was a troublemaker. Because in religious doctrine, namely St. Augustine, there are exceptions for women and men both dressing in the other gender's clothing. Most commonly, that was if you needed to escape or protect yourself in a time of war, it was excused. If you needed to protect yourself from rape, was added by the church in the coming centuries, all right? And if you read the transcripts of the trial, you'll find that she chose to wear the men's clothing because she, unlike most female prisoners, was not transferred to a nunnery. She was maintained in a military prison under military guard by the opposing force. The threat of rape was real. In fact, she chose to sew her clothes together, top and bottom, and to wear 2 layers in order to prevent the rape. Finally, as it became clear that she would be convicted of wearing men's clothing and being put to death as a heretic, she asked to put on a dress, and the request was denied. It was very clear that they wanted her dead. And that is how things ended up. She is not only, it's not the only woman who is notable in the military tradition of Anglo-Americans. Here you see the statue, Victorian time period erected there, of Boudica. There are many ways that her name is pronounced, mostly because of Renaissance time period misspellings, right? Boetica, Boudica. She was a queen, a Celtic queen, the Iceni tribe. And when her husband died, the Romans seized her properties and began the punishment of her peoples. They were seizing control there. Because previously he had been allowed to rule, but upon his death, they determined that they would not honor their treaty with the woman and her 2 daughters. Instead, they move in with military force. They take her, the queen, and the Celtic tribes respected queens as well as kings. It was all about the nobility of the blood. She could have easily ruled under their tradition. They tied her to a post and they whipped her. They beat her. When she continued to mount resistance, they took her 2 daughters and they raped them repeatedly. And they did this in order to make her feel vulnerable. This is the most powerful of you among you, and you are now completely, utterly, physically vulnerable. So it was a symbolic act. It also would mean that those royal members of the bloodline were no longer marriageable. So it was essentially the ending of that bloodline. So, here I have a quotation from Tacitus, the Roman who provides us with the account of her. We British, she allegedly said this, right? We British are used to women commanders in war. I am descended from mighty men, but I am not fighting for my kingdom and wealth now. I am fighting as an ordinary person for my lost freedom, my bruised body and my outraged daughters. Consider how many of you are fighting and why. Then you will win this battle or perish. That is what I, a woman, plan to do. Let the men live in slavery if they will. Now, Tacitus goes on to describe in detail the revolt led by this woman. It involved both men and women, and even adolescents in utter warfare. Entire Roman towns were burnt to the ground, and there's evidence of this today. So, clearly, in the Anglo-American tradition, during extreme threats to the nation and to the family, to security, it's acceptable for women to be part of that response. And certainly that is part of our understanding as feminists of gender. Socioeconomic class has long served to overturn any gendered expectations. We have the example of a religious woman. Joan of Arc would go on to be a saint. We have the evidence of Boudica, who is of royal blood. I could go on with Queen Victoria, under whom empire spread, as well as Elizabeth I. But no one puts it quite as simply as Sojourner Truth, right? In 1851, she maintained that man over there says that women need to be helped into carriages and lifted over ditches, and to have the best place everywhere. Nobody ever helps me into carriages or over mud puddles or gives me any best place. And ain't I a woman? Look at me, look at my arm. I have plowed and planted and gathered into barns, and no man could head me. And ain't I a woman? I could work as much and eat as much as a man when I could get it, and bear the lash as well, and ain't I a woman? Certainly this woman, who allegedly was 6 feet tall, was an imposing presence, and her example demonstrates just how clearly the middle class depiction of women as frail, weak, items to be taken care of by men, of protected status, do not apply to people of the working class, or clearly slaves. Let's talk about war briefly as we start to look at the working class women who traveled with the soldiers and who also served as soldiers, either knowingly or unknowingly. The entire nation was at war for hundreds of years, with very little peace in between. The entire nation felt great animosity towards the French. They characterized the French as being feminine. This is classic rejection of the female. That was the criticism in part for the French. They had effeminate mannerisms. They conducted themselves inappropriately in public, obvious sexuality. Their men, not only did their mannerisms seem feminine to the British, but also their dress. And repeated public examples of women being involved in politics, in appointment of general officers, all because of sexual affairs lent to the French in both politically and as far as like a public image, this effeminacy. So it is no wonder that women would find that casting off the feminine was useful to them. The life of a soldier during this time was not a pretty one. It was one of deprivation and extreme physicality. It was also one that was not always chosen. Either it was forced on them because of their poverty, or what's called impressment. Whenever nations were at war, they had legal authority to go and seize unemployed young men, young citizens, and force them into service. And we think the draft's bad, right? But certainly, being working class in Britain was a great risk. If a naval ship was on the waters and encountered one of the British merchant ships, and that naval ship needed men because of death, disease, whatever, they had the legal right and authority to go aboard that ship and seize people to serve. So it was no joke. Now, it was also an opportunity for those who needed to better their lives, be it the younger sons of Britain's royal families, the nobility, where they would not be inheriting anything. They could go away and be apprenticed to be young officers in the Navy, or they could go to the military academies and receive, or purchase actually, their commissions into the Army. Even their lives had some hardship, but certainly the lower class men suffered the worst of it. Marching, living in close quarters. This was the time before vaccinations. There were no army cooks. Instead, either their wives or other working class women were paid very little to come into the military encampments and to cook and clean and sew and nurse these men. In fact, military wives is the other part of my research, and they certainly did serve. They were officially recognized by the military, and each of the military units received monies in order to pay for their food and such. The soldiers did not receive that food. If you were a single enlisted man and you had a wife, then you had to pay for your children and your wife a place to live and her food out of your allowance. Marriage was not popular in the enlisted ranks. Prostitutes were much cheaper, right? Just simple. And it's really very sad to see how this entire class of people were misused. Certainly there's the term cannon fodder. Many of them were ill-trained, sick, underfed, so they quickly fell. Many of the women who accompanied these men would have their husbands die, and there was no legal obligation to provide anything to those women. Nothing. The officers of a unit, by tradition, would take up monies in order to send her back home to Britain. Most often, she married the next guy that she could find and continued her status as a military wife. Now, percentage-wise, it varied in the 1700s up through the Napoleonic Wars. You're talking like Wellington's force of 60,000 men was served by an official on the strength, that's what it was called, number of women of 4,500. So that's pretty good. Sometimes it was as low as 3 women per 300 men. That's a lot of sewing and cooking. I would not want to be involved in that. But there were other ways for women to travel and provide services with their husbands. There were always the women who were not on the strength, meaning there were no official foods provided for them, no official transportation. Instead, they would follow behind. And it was at their own risk. Many of them found employment in the neighboring towns, and they were forced to travel behind the marching unit. They were still vulnerable to artillery fire. And all of these women, both on the strength and the unofficial women, fell under military law. The most common punishment for these women was the whirligig, which is a steel cage where you're spun and made a spectacle of in the hot sun. Not very comfortable. And women could be beaten, and there was usually a sergeant who was put in charge of those women. But more commonly, the senior officer wife would also step in and try to maintain order among the wives. What were these women guilty of? Selling sexual services and spreading disease sometimes, or at least being condemned as such. What were they guilty of? They brewed beer and kept the men too intoxicated to function properly, right? Even something as simple as serving bad food could lead to punishment under these rules. Now, there's also a very interesting law that I found when I was researching how these women lived, and that is there was a distinct prohibition beginning with Charles II, an actual king's order that women in the encampment or in the line troops of men who were found to be wearing men's clothing were to be flogged and sent home. Now, that made me think, were so many women cross-dressing that there needed to be a royal proclamation? And I think so. There's no way that I can find exact numbers. Most of the evidence that I have found is anecdotal. There's Phoebe Hessel, whose tombstone in Britain claims that she earned distinction at the Battle of Bunker Hill. There are a number of women who were receiving pensions through the military, and these pensions were granted based on their claims to military service. So that would indicate to me that certainly there is that possibility. By the 1800s, the newspapers were filled with accounts of these women. The headline in the newspaper would be something like, "Another female soldier found, ... Female sailor kicked off such and such ship." Now, I'm not the first person to notice this. Diane Dugow has an entire study of what is the female warrior ballad tradition. I do not deal with the ballads. She did an excellent job. Instead, I deal with autobiographical accounts of these women. Ballads began with these female warriors in the 1600s, and by 1750, instead of these women being present in ballads with songs and caricatures, it moved to entire small either pamphlets, and I'm going to pass these around so that you can see the difference in what I'm talking about. You would occasionally have short pamphlets, and why pamphlets? And oh my goodness, I didn't address, why haven't people studied this before? Because it's working class literature. That's why. It's thought to not have an aesthetic value. Of course, we know that it was a revision in the 1900s of that, but this is the kind of pamphlet, this is a religious pamphlet, so it's not the right topic, but I'm going to pass it around so you can see and feel. This is thick, coarse, cheap paper, short topic. So you would only have a few tales of the female soldier. The accounts in battle. You might have an article in a newspaper, and this is a popular newspaper of the later period I was talking about, 1804. This is the Gentleman's Magazine. And I'm going to pass this around so you can get a feel for this as well and see the random articles and the rough paper. So I'll pass a few of those around. You might see a column. You might also see a poem such as that of Mary Robinson talking about the encampment with all of its bustle. In fact, I would like to read an excerpt from that poem. Tents, marquees, and baggage wagons, sutling houses, beer and flagons, drums and trumpets singing, firing, girls seducing, beaux admiring. Country lasses gay and smiling, city lads their hearts beguiling, dusty roads and horses frisky, many an Eton boy in whiskey. Taxed carts full of farmers' daughters, brutes condemned and man who slaughters. Public houses, booths and castles, bells of fashion serving vassals, lordly generals fiercely staring, weary soldiers sighing, swearing. The encampments, it's its entire culture, it's itself. Mary Robinson was showing you just how not very military orderly this community was. They were all over Britain. They were all over America. If you go up to the West Point area, you can see where General Washington encamped. They still have a few structures up there. It was an incredible attraction. People would take their lunch baskets and go sit on a hill to watch the soldiers drill. The royal family would trot out to watch the generals, who often were relatives, conduct these small encampments. In fact, Georgiana, Duchess of Devonshire, she is responsible for the first really open journalistic condemnation of women in men's dress. Apparently, she had tailored for her followers a mock red coat that she would wear out to these encampments, and it horrified people, in part because of her political power, in part because of her lack of fidelity to her legal husband, but also because it perhaps was somehow toying with the idea that these encampments were spectacles of masculinity. Hannah Snell, which is the most famous of the warrior women in that British tradition, shown here in one of the engravings used in her books. There's also another one I'd like for you to pay attention to. Notice how very different they are. These are the two most popular engravings of her that accompanied the publication of her story. Isn't that a bit more harsh? Notice the very short curly hair, the stern face, slight indication of breasts, certainly standing very male and with the drilling staff. Here, not quite so obvious, is it? It's a little more respectful. It's actually a little more accurate. I like to think of the other as a cheap caricature, right? And they did accompany two different versions of the tale because her story became so popular. And this also is why it was not studied, that it was considered to be false. So I'd like for us to take a moment and think about what was the response to these tales? And why has it been ignored? What is our own response? The most common response I get, and there was an Australian research librarian, who published a book on her a few years ago. He actually tried to trace her through government documents. She did exist. She did put on displays. After 1750, she owned a pub called the Female Soldier, and she put on productions where she would sing marching cadence, she would do rifle drills, and she would march around and tell stories of her travels. This is the first condemnation she receives because it's thought that she was producing these tales just to make money or to justify receiving a pension, which she eventually did receive a small pension. The other reason is that government documents are a little iffy on tracing her whereabouts at that time. It is clear that her brother-in-law enlisted into the military at that time, but it's also maintained that she continued to stay home and raise her children. So, what is possible there, do you think?
She took the place of her brother-in-law?
Thank you. She'd need a name, wouldn't she? And wouldn't that be convenient? She could protect her brother-in-law from being forcefully enlisted. And let's be honest, why would women choose to go into the military this way? Security. Money. Given the working class lifestyle, lack of food, prone to disease, and hard physical labor for women, why wouldn't she? Men's clothing would serve her as well as Joan of Arc, preventing rape. Now, I've even read and heard folks talking about, well, that doesn't make sense. I mean, there are some very practical things about wearing men's clothing and women being in the military, right? There are problems. Wouldn't they notice that she didn't go to the bathroom the same way? Dildos were not new to modern America. They were ancient. I show you what our own military right now issues to female soldiers so that they do not have to take their pants off. Thus, for many reasons, speed, right, when you need to get back in the vehicle. 2, less vulnerable to rape, let's be honest, right? Is it feasible that these women of that time could have manufactured their own very simple device? Mm-hmm. Of course. Yeah. Really. And, yes, wouldn't the men be surprised if, all of a sudden the woman has her period, right? Let's be honest about body fat. A starving soldier on the march for 12, 15 miles a day. She wouldn't have one. That's right. That's right. So, really, is there anything to say that she would not be able to serve hidden? I don't find a convincing case there. Now, even if it was true that these women did not serve, and there are quite frankly so many stories that I tend to believe, and I haven't even talked about the 20th century ones, right? Russia had its own female units. Number 1 sniper in World War I and II, actually World War II, female. In our modern military, women tend to do better because they don't have bad habits from hunting to undo when they come into the military. Right. But what is the possibility? What is the impact? What are the good things that can come out of this image? Well, at that time, during the Napoleonic Wars, there was this incredible threat of invasion, right? Napoleon was taking Europe. The Britons lived in incredible fear of an invasion. In fact, he did try a couple of times, near Normandy, I think it is, he did go and train soldiers there for a crossing, but the weather never worked for him. But that didn't stop the Britons from fearing it. Remember that only a few decades before, Charles II had come back from exile that same way. So, some of the working class women saw these encampments, saw their husbands going off to be volunteers, kind of like reserves, drilling in the local area, and they actually applied to the Viscount in charge of their area and said, "We want arms and we want training. Our men are going to be away when this happens, and we want to be trained." It was repeatedly denied. However, it is thought that some of them did conduct their own training. Allegedly, they wore red capes and had large farming implements. And there is a record of a poor French spy who turned himself in very bad condition, that alleged he had been battered so badly by these women on the shore. So certainly that's a good thing. And who's to say but that this image of a national heroine circulated in these broadsides, in these newspapers, through these cheap pamphlets, didn't inspire those women to take matters into their own hands? Isn't it really just in keeping with the tradition of Boudica? Watching out for those fierce invaders. From a literary perspective, however, what can I say that we can get from these? I think there are wonderful accounts in keeping with the travel literature of the time period. There are details of battles. And I have to question what Tim O'Brien maintains about war literature. In the things they carried, he asks us to question the matter of truth, because there are many levels of truth, many layers to it. In particular, in his account of Vietnam, there are contradictions. There are multiple perspectives, multiple tellings and retellings of the same event. And always the criticism that nobody could have really gone through all of this and survived. Basically, the response to that is, does it matter if this one character did not really, whatever that is, go through this? Is it that instead a higher truth about war is being transmitted here through O'Brien's tales? So, wouldn't it also be fair to say that perhaps there's some higher truth about the condition of women in that society that these tales are presenting to us? One of a very harsh working reality. They disappear around 1850. So they were active as ballads 1600 to 1650. By 1750, they're firm in this, longer text version. Why did they disappear by 1850? What was it they were contributing to that society, to the idea of nation? By 1840, 1850, Britain was empire. No longer was there a true threat of invasion. I mean, there were a few scares. There are always a few scares where men would rush and sign up for their local volunteers. But most of the military's might occurred on other continents, was exercised on other continents. The military became the military of empire, not one of defense. And so it's very clear that women had a very different role to play in that. Not that of defending nationhood, of defining that which is British. Even their women were better than the French. There were other social changes at that time that changed the perspective of women in general with relation to war. I ask you to think about Industrial Revolution and what happened with women there, or the growing urban areas, right? Women whose very active physical labor is seen as contributing to the whole community and its well-being, to the farm, to the family, ceases to exist. We have increasing literate public reading this trash that says women are supposed to do needlepoint and live happily ever after, blah, blah, blah. Not the reality of the working class woman who was now trying to raise her family in the slums of a British city. Since that was an increasingly hidden world, you no longer would see this contribution. You also saw an increasingly professional military. Okay? Don't need the same large numbers to go into the peninsula now. Instead, I need soldiers who are well trained, and you're going to be deployed for 3 years. You're going to India, right? So war was distanced from the general populace anyway. The experience of war was not encampments either all over Britain that we could go and watch over lunch and that where we could meet our future husbands, right? Instead, it was a thing that we knew only through these newspaper articles. It too was distance in that way. And lastly, I ask you to think about what Eisenhower, yes, I'm coming back to the United States for a second. Eisenhower warned about that military-industrial complex, and that certainly was at work at that time. Remember that I mentioned that Wellington's army of 60,000 had 4,500 women authorized to go with them for cooking and all other support functions? That became a business. That was exported to India, right? And even the changes in the university system sought to erase women's presence there. Yes, we could keep St. Joan of Arc, we could keep Boudica, right? These legends. They weren't real anyway, right? Military strategy and military history became fields of study. And there, we privilege the strategy and heroism. We don't talk about the logistical functions. And that's where women certainly had a role. Historians now are even asking us to rethink that. How much of the logistical movement belonged to women? How the armies, and I have some of the 1700 and 1800 documents, where military commanders of larger armies praise women. They justified to hire commanders, bigger ships to take more women for its civilizing effect, is what they called it. Right? Certainly, the communities into which these armies entered would find it much better to have women already attached in providing these functions, rather than changing the economics and the marriage market, let's be honest. Okay? I continue to research these, and I look forward to updating you on further of these as I find them. I open the floor to questions. Ma'am.
Did the change that you saw in 1850 sort of mirror that cult of domesticity that sprang up in the United States?
Yeah, it's a lot of the same things at work. The cult of domesticity actually, I think, in Britain began with the Romantic era poets and writers. The glorification of sensibility. And you always have Jane Austen's persuasion.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Other questions?
Well, I have another question.
Sure. All right.
I was always curious about if there was an exact time when impressments stopped. Now, I know after the Napoleonic Wars there was less of a need for it. And then something that I read, one of the historical works said that it was also a volunteer army that started, so that sort of changed things. I am not quite clear, however, on when that change took place to a volunteer military.
Yeah, I don't know the exact dates. There are, Ennis is his last name, Ennis. He's at Delaware. And that's, impressment's more his area. But I do know that just the general readings of military law that I conducted do indicate that we want volunteer soldiers. They're better. They actually want to be there. Not a greater chance of mutiny and things like that. One of the ways that this was accomplished was through the building of barracks, okay? And that principle is still at work here today, is one way we can get you to stay into the military is make room for your family so that they pressure you to stay. It's a very good situation. Also, where you had folks going away for such a long period of time, and in areas where it was thought to be greater access to resources, these were seen as positive moves, right? Positive moves for their own economic betterment. I don't know an exact year. But I would also ask you to think about, can we say that impressment really has ended for all? Yeah. There's still stories of people saying they get the go to jail or go in the army. To me, that's kind of impressment. But as an official military policy, I would date it in the early 1800s, certainly.
Yeah.
Other questions?
Have you ever read of any women being impressed and then released?
I have not. Hannah Snell and Susanna Cope.
If they would already, they could be impressed if they were already cross-dressing, is that what you're saying?
Well, if they were cross-dressing and they were in the military, or they were...
Or that
the merchant vessel.
Yeah. And actually these recruiting officers had quotas.
Yes.
So I've never read that account, But certainly there would be that pressure as well for them to convince a woman to go in. Most of the accounts, okay, the ballad tradition has it that women are often going to either search for their lost husband or to accompany the lost husband. There are accounts supported by newspapers also that, for instance, that young officer who has a mistress, well, he needs a footman or a drummer boy. Boom. Great way to take them with you for a few years, right? Christine Davies and Hannah Snell both, in their accounts, it addresses how they prepared and went in. So they saw in the local pub that a king's crown was being given to people to sign their name. And so they went home and they cut their hair and they donned, the brother-in-law's clothing, and off they went and were hustled onto ship.
Gave a false name.
Yes. Yeah. Or their mark. In fact, these are doubly dispossessed women. This is the front piece. A lot of the tales also contained letters at the very front attesting to, I'm a witness, this person gave this account of her life to me. And here is Hannah Snell's mark. She was illiterate.
Just a lot of novels of the era start that way too, saying this is the truth.
Mm-hmm. and thus the question of what is truth? What is it? And does it matter if we accept it as truth and it changes our society and our actions? There is a kind of truth to that.
Is there any truth to flogging through the fleet? And if that ever happened to a woman, I just wonder if it has ever happened where that's how the woman is exposed.
I don't know about the fleet, but there's an account in the Revolutionary War of the Army. Yes, they were flogging a soldier, and as the shirt was ripped away, wounds were also an opportunity for them to be exposed, the dressing of wounds and such.
Yeah.
Very few volunteered the knowledge. Hannah Snell did, and that too is why they suspect that she was presenting a false account, because she allegedly, after getting off ship, takes her mates to the local pub, buys a round, and says, "Hey, I'm a girl." So. Are there other questions? So the books that I sent round, I didn't send these. Yeah, you can keep those out there, and I'll come get them later. But I wanted you to notice the very crass nature of these, and then maybe contrast them to, this is what a middle-class book would have looked like. This is from like 1809 or something like that. You're welcome to touch. They're not museum quality if you wanted to see what those are like. Because that is one of the major distinctions here. The fact that this is working class. This is something that with a limited vocabulary and reading ability you would be able to access, as opposed to a novel.
I must say though,
Yeah.
they made good paper in those days. I've seen late 19th century books that just crumble.
Open that book. I mean, it's fabulous. It's still readable. Yeah. Are there other questions? If not, I hope to see you at next month's Women on Wednesdays. Thanks.